and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson. This is my first video on repertoire that I would consider to be pedagogically significant. I'm going to do a series on repertoire like this, which I think is really helpful for the student or even for more advanced pianists who want to develop their piano technique. And I feel like a series of this sort would really be incomplete if I didn't discuss Carl Czerny, a wonderfully serious musician, composer, pianist, pedagogue, who is unfortunately much reviled in much piano talk nowadays. People say all kinds of negative things about Czerny in general, but he was really a very solid musician. He was, of course, Beethoven's student for a while, and also a very significant teacher for Liszt. He taught him for only a brief period, but Liszt always spoke about what a beneficial effect that Czerny had on him. And of course, Liszt dedicated his Transcendental Etudes, the first edition of his Transcendental Etudes, to Czerny as well. And although there are certainly many things that he leaves out about what's important in piano technique in his writings and in his studies, I think he definitely understood a good deal, much more than many people at the time, about how to develop fluidity and facility in piano playing. And of all the various piano etudes which are out there, which you can find, among which are excellent collections of studies like the Gradus ad Parnassum of Clementi or the Etudes of Kramer, Czerny's really strike me as being some of the best that are available and the most efficient. First off, they're brilliantly graded, all of them, although every collection that he wrote has a different starting point for difficulty. So he has collections which are quite appropriate for near beginners, like Opus 599. You could start that comfortably as soon as you can really read on the staff and know the finger numbers. There are other collections like the School for the Virtuoso, which is incredibly difficult. He starts from a point where he's understanding that you're already a pretty impressive virtuoso and you're just trying to take your technique to another level. All of his etudes cover a wide degree of techniques, and although the first few etudes in some of these collections maybe focus a little too much on C major, he always gets into many different keys and many different positions by the time he gets to the end of any given collection. I think most people don't manage to make it to the end of most of his collections because his etudes get very, very difficult by the end. Many of them rival or even surpass in difficulty the etudes of Chopin and Liszt. For example, in the Opus 740, there's a famous octave etude. I believe there's even a piano roll recording of Joseph Levine playing this etude, and it's one of the most difficult etudes out there. It's definitely as difficult as many a Liszt etude. However, in addition to having this peak of technical difficulty, Czerny etudes are very different from Chopin and Liszt in that they also provide the foundational technique. He provides many etudes which are very approachable and which can take you from a certain place to the level which will enable you to play these great and difficult compositions by composers like Chopin or Liszt. Now, there's a bit of a controversy here because there's a school of thought, much in evidence in message boards dedicated to piano practice, that we should never waste our time with unmusical things like Czerny or any other exercises either. And at the base of it, this is kind of a beautiful idea. Maybe life is too short to waste it on anything which is not great music. Unfortunately, if you do really want to be a piano virtuoso at the highest level, this isn't very realistic. It's quite difficult to just jump into playing things like a Chopin etude without having trained the reflexes in your arms and hands with a great deal of other repertoire. And although it's quite true you can get an enormous amount of technical improvement from pieces by great composers, things like Bach's Inventions and Symphonias and the Well-Tempered Clavier, which is as close to indispensable as anything can be in keyboard repertoire. And of course, you can find many other pieces which are technically very adroit and which give you a lot of development. Sonatas by Scarlatti, for example, the great classical sonatas of Mozart and Haydn, Beethoven, Clementi. However, as you reach advanced levels, you'll discover that there's a certain gulf in technique that really separates everything before the 19th century and the development of Chopin and Liszt's technique. Those are really the names that I keep coming back to at any rate. So simply meaning that studying Bach, for example, if you studied all the Inventions and Symphonias and all of the Well-Tempered Clavier, that's indispensable, certainly, for playing Chopin really, really well. but it doesn't automatically put you in a place where you can master some of the difficulties that Chopin presents from a purely physical perspective. So there is a kind of chasm that exists here. And it's certainly possible to cross that gulf in many different ways. You could certainly do it without ever practicing an exercise or a scale. I'm sure many people have managed to do this. However, it's not certain that everyone will be able to do this. Sometimes this has a lot to do with genetic qualities, what we usually call talent. Some people might be genetically very well set up to master certain technical difficulties without needing as much preparation. Certainly, Liszt and Chopin did without Czerny etudes. They didn't have those available when they were developing their technique. Czerny himself taught Liszt using the Calenti sonatas, which would also be an excellent way of bridging that gap between the pre-19th century and the 19th century technique. However, I think over his career as a pedagogue, what Czerny was trying to do as he wrote all these collections of studies was to find a more reliable and more direct way to do this, a way that would really work for a larger number of people who didn't necessarily have the kind of inherent genetic predisposition towards certain physical aspects of piano playing that someone like Liszt might have had, for example. You don't really see anywhere else quite so clearly the encapsulation of this transference from the older technique, which maybe culminates in someone like Beethoven, the technique that comes from Bach and even before Bach with the English virginal composers like Byrd and Gibbons, transforming into this new advanced technique of the Romantics, which of course goes into the 20th century and 21st centuries. There are other places where you can see this kind of transference and this development kind of clearly. For example, in the works of Felix and Fanny Mendelssohn, and to a certain degree in the Etudes of Kramer that I already mentioned, and Clementi's works. But if we're talking about being as efficient and direct as possible, I think really Czerny is the king and the most effective way to train yourself to attain all these different aspects of technique and get yourself to the place where you don't need etudes anymore, besides the really great ones, of course, by Chopin and Liszt and Scriabin and Rachmaninoff and so forth. Now, my contention here is not that you should spend hours and hours every day practicing Czerny studies. I think that would be quite stultifying, because although the charge that Czerny is unmusical is totally unfounded and unfair, his studies are actually quite charming and musical, but you could hardly call them great music. To me, they're a little bit of the same kind of musical rhetoric as what you get in the charming operas of the day that were very light and very popular, very simple harmonically, very direct. That's what Czerny studies are really like. They're quite charming, they're quite tuneful even in a way, even though there's so much figuration, but they're hardly profound. They're hardly deep. They're hardly nourishing in a musical way. So you definitely don't want to be spending a huge percentage of your time studying Czerny, but you don't need to. That's the good thing. The most important thing is that you're working on etudes like this over a long period of time, a little bit each day. So for my own students, I would never really tell them to have more than one study by Czerny at a time. That would be plenty over a few years to really get the beneficial effect that I'm outlining. And although I can't scientifically state that this is the case, I've seen it work many times, and I think that the difference between using a series of studies like Czerny's and not using them would be quite noticeable if you could compare in one person. So I think that as you gradually go through many of them, you set up all these very beneficial technical habits that are going to help you in every repertoire you play, whether that is a Bach invention or whether that's the hardest Chopin etudes or Liszt etudes. So if you feel like attaining that highest level of technique which you need for the big pieces of the 19th century is impossible, Czerny can really help take you to that level over an extended period of time. It's not a magic trick. You have to practice it well and intelligently, but these etudes can really do things, incredible things for your technique. Now, the argument about being economical of time, I'm very aware of, because I always feel like I don't have enough time for all the practicing I want to do and all the repertoire I want to learn. So that's why I'm specifically recommending today's collection, which is probably my favorite Czerny collection, the 180 8-bar exercises, Opus 821. This is not one of the most famous of Czerny's collections, but I think it's one of the most efficient and complete. It starts at a place which is a little bit more advanced than something like Opus 599. It's not appropriate for a complete beginner, but someone who's been studying for a few years and whose technique is getting to a point where they can handle a lot of simple Baroque and classical repertoire, but they need a little extra push to get them to develop more. This can be a great place to start. And it goes all the way to the most advanced technique, comparable to the etudes of Chopin and Liszt. It does seem to me that Czerny's pedagogical sense was improving if you follow the trend of his pedagogy over the various opus numbers that he wrote. In this collection, I can imagine that he was considering to himself, how can I make a collection which covers an enormous range of technical problems, from moderately difficult to very advanced, and how can I do that in the most compact way possible, so it takes as little time as possible to attain. So among the advantages of this set are that, of course, each etude is very short. Every etude is only a single 8-bar phrase. However, within that restriction, Czerny has packed in every single possible technical challenge you can imagine, and some of a very subtle and varied sort. These are not all fast etudes. There are slow etudes that deal with matters of touch and balance, contrapuntal balance between different voices. Czerny does take you through every single key more than once as you get through all the 160 etudes. I can confidently assert if you practice and really master each one of these etudes from beginning to end, your playing will have been transformed by the time you get to the end of this book. And if you do it right, just one etude at a time, over a long period of time, it's going to take you a while, but it's very impressive. I would recommend it strongly. Now, as I said, it's really important to practice these pieces in the best way possible, and I can't go into exquisite detail in this video as I would in a lesson, but definitely you would want to practice each one of these exercises in various rhythms. For example, in bursts, this way, one of my favorite practicing techniques, goes kind of like this. Of course, that should be balanced with normal, relaxed, slow playing where you feel very comfortable and very at ease. You should also, of course, try to bring the tempo up to something fairly reasonable and rapid for these etudes based on Czerny's tempo marking. So for this first etude marked allegro, it might be something around this, which I think is about quarter note 144. Now, granted, you can get a lot of benefit from these etudes, even if you don't attain that rapid of a tempo, as long as it's something which pushes you just a little bit to play a little faster than you might have been comfortable with when you started practicing it. You will be gaining something already, as long as it can count as something close to an allegro. Now, as a further bonus, etudes which focus on the right hand, like this first one does, are also a great opportunity to practice in symmetrical inversion, so that your left hand never gets too bored. I think it's always important to try to equalize the study that we do with the right hand with the left hand in some way, and symmetrical inversion is a great way to do that. So that would look and sound kind of like this. So if you want to really pick that apart, you might watch that in slow motion and you can see how I'm symmetrically inverting. I explained it in another video, but basically the piano is a mirror image around middle D, so you can invert anything in the right hand into the exact same physical motions and fingering in the left hand if you if you remember that property of the piano's construction. But that's a bonus. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to do that. That's just something that I enjoy and I find to be really interesting and helpful for my technique. But as you can see, there's various ways you can treat all these etudes. And definitely, I think it would be wise to practice in this very intelligent way. So I'm going to continue this series. I'll probably try to record all these little etudes because I've studied them and I like to give them to my students when it seems appropriate. So as kind of examples and to point out various things in the etudes which are very interesting, I'll put them up once in a while. I'm also going to work on some other areas of repertoire which I think are pedagogically very significant for the learner out there. Things like the Bach conventions and sinfonias, which I already mentioned, and various Scarlatti sonatas and so forth, which I think are quite useful for the the intermediate to advanced student. But in the meantime, I will sign off. So please do consider supporting the channel. If you like my work, you can do that on patreon.com. And I also have my newest albums up there. I have 2 albums right now and planning to bring out some more, along with other items that I'm going to put on my store on Patreon. You don't have to be a subscriber to Patreon to access the items on my store. It's just a very convenient place for me to put all this extra material that I have. And I'm gradually going to put that up there because I'm phasing out my other website, my independentpianist.com website, which wasn't very useful for me and cost an arm and a leg. So I do recommend taking a look at my Patreon if you can, but also please just like the video, subscribe, and come back next week when I'll have some more great conversation for you. So until then, take care, keep practicing.